My name is Laura Morrison. I am 50 years old. At my father's retirement party last April, a man I had never seen before in my life pushed back his chair, stood up from a table across the restaurant, and walked toward me with a slight hitch in his right leg and an expression on his face like he was about to do something he had been working up to for a very long time. My older sister Patricia had just finished telling her husband, in the offhand way she always did, that I had been a helicopter pilot in the Army. Not real combat flying, she'd said. More like ambulance work in the sky. I had flown 308 Medevac missions. I had been shot at on 61 of them. I had never lost a patient who made it into my aircraft alive. The man stopped next to my chair. He said he was sorry to interrupt. He said he had heard my name. And then he said, "I need to know. Were you the pilot at Kunar? September 12th, 2010? I had not heard that date spoken out loud in almost 14 years. I want to tell you what happened after that moment, but I want you to understand something first. I want you to understand who I was before the Army and who the Army made me into, and what it actually cost to carry 308 of those days inside a body that never fully recovered from any of them. And I want you to understand my sister. Not just the words she said at the party, which were wrong, but the whole complicated architecture of how two women can grow up in the same house and arrive at such entirely different understandings of each other. Because what happened at my father's party was not simply a moment of being seen after years of being invisible. It was older and quieter than that. It was about what it means to spend a career doing work that looks like one thing from the outside and is entirely something else from inside the cockpit, and to have the people who love you most be the ones who can't tell the difference. This is that story. I grew up in Macon, Georgia. My father, James Morrison, spent 30 years as a project manager for the Georgia Department of Transportation. He built bridges and highways and drainage systems that still carry traffic across the middle of the state. He is a practical man, a patient man, the kind of man who believes that the most important work is work that holds things together and makes other things possible even when no one is watching. He taught me that. I don't think he ever fully understood what I would eventually do with the lesson, but he gave it to me and I carried it forward. My mother died when I was 11, ovarian cancer. It moved fast, the way it sometimes does, and then she was gone, and we were left in a house in Macon with our father and a particular kind of silence that had no name. Patricia was 15. She was old enough to have learned our mother's organizational intelligence before she left, and she used it. She made lists, she kept schedules, she handled things. She got straight A's through the grief and won a full scholarship to Emory and became a business litigation attorney in Atlanta who wins more often than she loses and runs a calendar that would terrify most people. She is sharp and she is capable and she loves me with the kind of love that has always been slightly too efficient to feel warm, though I know it is warm. I have always known it is warm. It is love that comes packaged in management, and that is simply how she gives it. I accepted that a long time ago. I became something else. I spent 3 years being mostly quiet, reading, watching the sky through whatever window I was nearest to. Our neighbor, a retired school teacher named Harold Briggs, kept a small Cessna at an airfield outside of town, and one Saturday morning when I was 14, he offered to take my father and me up for a short flight, 20 minutes over Macon. I remember looking out the window as we banked and seeing the river and the highways and the rooftops, and the particular feeling was not excitement, it was recognition, as if the ground had never been the right altitude for me and this was simply the correction. I never fully came back down after that. I worked at a hardware store for 2 years after high school and 2 years of community college, and then I walked into an Army recruiting office in downtown Macon and told the recruiter I wanted to fly. He explained the warrant officer pilot program. I said, "Show me where to sign." My father drove me to the MEP station in Atlanta at 4:30 in the morning and shook my hand at the door and said, "Call when you land," and that was our version of a long goodbye, which is to say it was exactly right. Fort Rucker, Alabama, is where the Army trains all of its helicopter pilots. I spent 18 months there learning things that rewired every instinct I had about how to move through the world. My instructor was a warrant officer 4 named Calloway who had more combat flight hours than anyone I have ever met before or since, and who communicated primarily through a set of specific silences. A short silence meant, "Keep going." A slightly longer silence meant, "Think about what you just did." A particular deep silence meant, if you do that again, you will not be my student tomorrow. I learned to read his silences the way other people learn to read words on a page. And by the end of my time at Rucker, I was flying in a way that felt less like operating a machine and more like making a decision about physics. I was second in my class. The first was a man named Carter James Whitfield from Fort Smith, Arkansas, who had reflexes that seemed to arrive before the stimulus did. I have told him that. He laughed and said I had better hands in the weather, and bad weather is when it counts. He was not wrong. I fly well in bad weather. I have a theory about why, which is that bad weather removes every option except the correct one, and having fewer choices has always suited me better than having more. I chose Medevac. My final assignment counselor asked me why, and I told him the truth. I said because I want my flights to matter in a way I can count. He said all flights matter. I said, yes, sir, but I want to be sure. He looked at me with the look of someone deciding whether to push back, and then he decided not to, and I got my assignment. Let me tell you what Medevac actually is, because I want this to be accurate. A Medevac crew flies a U-860 Black Hawk helicopter configured as a flying hospital. The aircraft weighs over 22,000 pounds fully loaded. It is over 53 feet long. The crew is 4 people: pilot, co-pilot, medic, and crew chief. You carry patients who are wounded, some critically, some who will not survive regardless of what you do, some who will survive only because of what you do, and you will never know which is which until it is over. You fly in conditions other aircraft are grounded for. You fly at night wearing NVGs, night vision goggles, which restrict your field of vision and wash the world in green phosphor and require an entirely different set of instincts than daylight flying because depth perception is compromised and distances deceive, and the terrain that looks passable at altitude looks entirely different when you are 60 feet off the ground in a narrow valley with rotor wash coming back at you off the canyon walls. You fly in dust and in fog and in the particular kind of mountain weather that can change from navigable to unsurvivable in the time it takes to commit to an approach. You fly into active firefights. This is the part that does not fit in the ambulance metaphor. An ambulance goes where people have already made it safe enough to go. An ambulance operates inside a system of cleared roads and established routes and incident command structures where someone has already pushed the danger back far enough to allow access. What I did was fly a 53-foot aircraft into the most dangerous locations on a combat map, in the dark, in the mountains, with rounds coming up from below and the clock running on patients who could not wait for safe and extract human beings and bring them to surgical care fast enough that being alive was still an option. The difference between those two descriptions is not a question of vocabulary. It is a question of understanding what the actual work is. My first deployment was to Kunar Province in 2007. I was 28 years old. My co-pilot was a warrant officer from Colorado named Marcus Green, who had been flying Medevac for 4 years and who had the very specific calm of someone who has been genuinely frightened enough times that the baseline fright no longer registers as a sensation. He was a good teacher. He taught me things no manual contains. Things like how to read the behavior of a landing zone from 200 feet to know whether someone on the ground is trying to wave you in or wave you off. Things like how to listen to the sound of the rotors in a way that tells you what the air is doing before the instruments catch up. Things that live in your hands and your ears and the particular part of your body that knows before your mind does. I flew 64 missions in that first deployment. I was shot at 14 times. This is not a figure I say for effect. I say it because it is the number, and the number is the truth, and the truth is what I have available to offer. I came home from Kandahar and went back to Fort Rucker as an instructor for 2 years. I liked teaching. I was good at it. My students told me later that what they remembered most from my instruction was not any specific technique, but something I said on the first day, which was, the aircraft will tell you everything you need to know. You need to learn to be quiet enough to hear it. Several of them have told me that I am glad it landed. My second deployment was Kunar Province in 2009. This is the deployment where the shoulder happened. It was a night extraction in the Arganda Valley in Kandahar Province, September of 2009. My co-pilot that rotation was a warrant officer from Ohio named Daniel Park, 24 years old, careful and precise in the way of someone who has studied everything and trusted his preparation. We were 30 minutes into an extraction when a round came through the lower left fuselage and struck something in the electrical system that caused a momentary failure in the hydraulic flight control assist. For approximately 4 seconds, I was flying a 22,000-pound aircraft on pure muscle. No assist. The controls went rigid and the aircraft wanted to go where its mass wanted it to go, which was not where I needed it to go. And Daniel had his hands on his controls the same moment I had mine on mine, and we both held it, and then the system came back online and we completed the extraction and we landed everyone alive. But I tore something in my right shoulder doing it. Not catastrophically, not in a way that required immediate surgery, not in a way that grounded me for more than 3 weeks. Enough. The tendon healed slowly and incorrectly in the way that things heal when you don't give them the full rest they need, when you go back to work before you're done recovering because the work is waiting. For the last 15 years, my right shoulder aches with cold weather, with sustained stress, with long drives, with the specific exhaustion that comes from carrying something enormous inside your chest while your face says everything is fine. It aches reliably, and I know its rhythms well enough now to read it the way I read weather, as information rather than complaint. I received my first Air Medal with Valor device for a mission in Korengal Valley in 2008. I will not detail that mission here because it belongs to the soldiers who were in it and not to me. What I will say is that the valley was narrow and the assessment said the risk was too high for aircraft, and I went in anyway, and everyone who was alive when they reached my aircraft stayed alive. That is the only metric that has ever mattered to me. I received my second Air Medal with Valor device for September 12, 2010, Kunar Province. That is the date the man at the restaurant asked about. I have 2 decorations in a box in my bedroom closet in Savannah. I do not display them. I do not take them out and look at them. They are proof for myself that the work was real and recognized by the institution that doesn't give those awards easily. They are not for anyone else to see. I never talk about them. This is not false modesty. It is simply that the decorations are a notation about specific moments, and the moments were real and are already complete. And taking the notation out to show people does not add anything to the reality of what happened in those moments. Patricia does not know they exist. I should back up and give you the full picture of Patricia, because she deserves that. She is 54 years old, and she has been practicing business litigation for 25 years, and she is legitimately brilliant at it. She reads people accurately. She builds arguments that close every exit before the other side realizes the exits are gone. And she wins. Her husband, David, is a real estate attorney, also successful, also smart. And they have a life in Atlanta that reflects the accumulation of 2 intelligent people working hard for 2.5 decades. Emma, their oldest, works in marketing at a firm downtown. Thomas, their youngest, is studying civil engineering at Georgia Tech and is quiet and curious in a way that reminds me of myself at that age. Patricia and I have always had a relationship that exists most honestly in the spaces between conversations. We love each other. We have never fully understood each other. The mechanism of her understanding is categorization. She puts things in correct places and refers to them efficiently. I am in a place in her mental filing system. The place has a label that reads, Laura, younger sister, Army helicopter pilot, medical transport, not combat, good with her hands, quiet, probably fine. The label was built from limited data, and I have never given her better data because she has never asked for it in the way that would actually let her receive it. She asks the way you ask when you already have the answer and you are looking for confirmation. I give her the confirmation because correcting her feels like an act of aggression I never wanted to commit. This has been the pattern for 20 years, and I have made peace with it. The peace is not resignation. It is the specific kind of acceptance that comes from understanding that some distances do not close because both people prefer other things to closing them. My father's retirement party was on a Saturday in April at a restaurant called the Corner Table in downtown Macon. The Corner Table has been in the same location for 31 years. They serve very good fried catfish and sweet tea in mason jars, and the floors are original wood that have absorbed enough of the town's history that they feel like they belong to it. My father had not wanted a party. He had said repeatedly, in the weeks leading up to it, that all he wanted for his retirement was a quiet dinner, immediate family only, no speeches, no slideshow. Patricia had said, absolutely, of course, I completely understand, and had then organized a gathering of 47 people 3 floral arrangements, a custom cake with a frosted rendering of a bridge on the top, and a 16-photo slideshow set to a song my father does not know he likes but does. That is also Patricia. She cannot help herself and she knows it, and she does not try to stop herself because in her understanding the management is the love. And it is. I know it is. She just doesn't leave any room for other versions of the love to exist beside it. I arrived 40 minutes early because I always do. I drove up from Savannah the night before and stayed at a Hampton Inn 5 minutes from the restaurant. I drive a 15-year-old Ford F-150 that I have owned since my second deployment. My best friend Rosalind Diaz, who I'll tell you about properly in a moment, has offered at least 9 times to go truck shopping with me. I tell her every time that the truck runs and it carries things. She says the definition of runs is doing a lot of work in that sentence. She is probably right. I drive it anyway. It is mine and it works and I understand it, and I do not require more from a vehicle than those 3 things. I walked into the corner table at 4:20 for a 5 o'clock event and sat at the bar with a glass of water and watched the staff finish setting up. The bartender's name was Marcus, and he asked if I was early for the Morrison party, and I said yes, and he said there was always one. I told him I preferred it quiet before the room filled. He nodded and left me alone, which I appreciated more than I could have said. I want to tell you about Rosalind Diaz before I go further, because she is the person who has known my career accurately for 20 years and whose knowledge of it has kept me from completely losing the ability to speak the truth out loud to anyone. Rosalind was in my pilot training class at Fort Rucker. She is exactly 4 feet, 11 and a half inches tall, which she will tell you if you ask and will correct you firmly if you round down. She talks faster than anyone I have ever known. She was raised in Corpus Christi, Texas, and has a laugh that carries across rooms and a precise sense of when something is genuinely funny versus when it just sounds like it should be. She flew Medevac for 8 years before a medical separation for a back injury sustained not in a firefight but while moving a couch in base housing, which she has described as the most embarrassing injury in the history of Army aviation. She retired to outside of Houston, married a man named Curtis who builds custom cabinetry and calls her by a nickname she won't tell me the origin of, and has 3 rescue dogs she refers to collectively as the Squadron. Rosalind was not at my father's retirement party. She had offered to come. She offered twice. She said she wanted to be there for the day my sister finally understood. I told her there was no such day coming, that the pattern was too old and too comfortable for either of us to change it, and that I had made my peace with the ambulance version. She said, "You've made peace with being wrong about yourself, and that's not the same thing." I said, "It's close enough." She said, "No, it isn't," but she did not push it, because Rosalind knows exactly when to stop. She sent me a card after the party. I'll tell you what it said later. The guests arrived at the restaurant in the way guests arrive at these things, in clusters and in conversation. The people who know each other already finding each other, and the people who don't standing slightly apart and looking for something to occupy their hands. Patricia came in with David and Emma and Thomas and immediately began managing the seating with the air of someone who had already decided the seating before arriving and was now enforcing the decisions. Her blazer was dark green. Her stride was the stride she has always had, the stride of someone who made all the decisions before entering the room and is now simply executing them. She hugged me. I said she looked good. She said I looked good. This exchange has occurred at the beginning of every family gathering for 20 years, and it covers exactly the same distance each time, which is the distance between the surface and the actual surface. My father arrived with his brother Carl and 2 of his oldest DOT colleagues, men named Henderson and Graves, who I had known since childhood and who both gave me the same look people give you when they watched you grow up and have not figured out what to do with the fact that you are now an adult. My father was wearing a gray suit he had pressed himself, and I could see the double crease on both sleeves where he had re-ironed them, which meant he had been more nervous about the party than he'd said. He hugged me for a long moment. He said he couldn't believe I'd driven all the way from Savannah. I said it was 3 hours. He said he knew, and that was the end of that part, which is how we often are. We have a small vocabulary with each other, and it does not need supplementing. We both know what we mean. There was a man at the party named Dale Webb, who I spotted immediately because he is 6'4" with white hair and the posture of someone who spent 28 years in the United States Army as a non-commissioned officer, retired as a command sergeant major. Dale was my father's college roommate, a friendship that has survived 50 years and shows no signs of weakening. He knew my commanding officer during my first deployment. He had inquired about my record through professional channels at some point in my first deployment and learned more about it than I ever told my family. He had never mentioned this at family events. I had asked him once, years ago, to leave it alone, and he had said, "Your call," and had kept the agreement without complaint. He found a table near the window and settled into it with the patience of a man who is very good at waiting for important things to happen on their own schedule. I was seated with my father, my uncle Carl, Dale, Henderson, and Graves. Patricia and David were at the next table with their children and three of Patricia's law partners from Atlanta. Smart-looking people with the manner of people accustomed to being right about things. David is a good man. He is warm and easy in the way that some people are genuinely interested rather than performed interested, and he has always been decent to me in the uncomplicated way that means he has no interest in the sorting that Patricia sometimes does. The dinner was good. The catfish was exactly as I remembered it from the years our father used to bring us here as children. The sweet tea was cold. The conversation moved around the table in the easy way of people who have known each other for a long time. The kind of conversation that is not really about information exchange, but about the pleasure of familiar company, the pleasure of still being here together after the years. Patricia gave a toast to my father that was genuinely excellent. She has the skills for it in a way I do not. She spoke about our father's patience, his steadiness, his gift for finding the one workable path through any problem. She said he had built things that would outlast all of them, which is both literally true and true in a larger way, and she said it with the warmth that she most reliably has for our father, which is a warmth without any management in it. She hit the notes she meant to hit. My father turned red around the ears and looked at his sweet tea and said, "Thank you, Patricia," when she finished, and she laughed and sat down, and he shook his head in the way he does when something is more than he expected. I did not give a toast. I had told my father the week before, on the phone, what I wanted him to know, and he had received it. That was enough for both of us. The part that changed everything happened during dessert. There was a table near the far wall of the restaurant that was not part of our party, just regular diners who had come in for a Saturday dinner and happened to sit near a large family gathering. I had registered them the way you register other occupied tables in a restaurant, which is to say I was aware they were there and then I was not aware of them. At that table, toward the window, there was a man. I noticed him at some point during the main course because Dale had used my name in a sentence loud enough to carry to the neighboring table. I noticed him because when the name reached him, he went very still. I am trained to notice when people stop moving in the middle of a movement. I noticed it, and I held it in the back of my mind without assigning it anything, the way you hold a data point that doesn't yet have a place to go. He was mid-40s, button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, the build of someone who works physically for a living. A slight hitch in the right leg when he walked that I had not yet seen but would see when he stood up. He was eating alone and reading something on his phone, and he had gone very, very still. David, Patricia's husband, asked me at some point during dessert whether I missed military flying, whether I'd ever considered commercial aviation. The kind of question you ask when you're interested in a general way. I gave him the kind of answer that fits that kind of question. Something brief and accurate enough to be polite. And then Patricia, without looking up from her slice of cake, said it the way she had always said it when explaining me to someone. She said, "David, she flew helicopters, but not in a combat role. More like aerial medical transport. Ambulance work in the sky, basically." She was not being cruel. I want to be absolutely clear about that. She has never been cruel about it. She was being efficient. She had a category for what I did, and she placed me in it and moved on. The category was wrong in a way that covered the distance between life and death for 308 human beings. But she did not know that. And in the architecture of her understanding, the category was correct. Medical transport, not combat, ambulance equivalent. She had built the category from the fragments she had been given over the years, the fragments I had offered in the conversations that fit the surface layer and nothing below it. My right shoulder ached. Dale Webb set his fork down on the table. He looked at me. He had been setting that fork down at family events for 20 years. He looked at me the way he always did when she said it, with the expression that means, "I'm here if you want it." I gave him the smallest shake of my head. He picked his fork back up. I was about to say something to my uncle about the cake when I heard the chair. It is a particular sound. A chair pushed back slowly, on a wood floor with intention. Not the quick squeak of someone getting up to find the restroom. The deliberate sound of someone who has made a decision and is now in the process of executing it. I turned my head toward the sound. The man, from the table by the wall, was standing. He was looking directly at me. He crossed the restaurant without hurrying, with the slight hitch in his right leg that I could see now. He stopped next to my chair. He said, "I'm sorry to interrupt." I said it was all right. He said, "I heard your name a little while ago." He paused. He said, "I've been sitting over there trying to decide whether to come over." He said, "I need to know. Are you the pilot from Kunar Province? September 12th, 2010? There was a particular quality to the silence at our table in the moment after he said that date out loud. It was not the absence of noise, because the restaurant was still fully present around us, the other tables and the clink of silverware and someone's child laughing at the back. But at our table, the air changed. My father looked up from his dessert. Patricia stopped talking. Dale put both hands flat on the tablecloth. David looked at me. I looked at this man, at his face, and I understood before he said another word what this was. I knew it the way you know certain things, not with analysis, but with recognition. I said yes. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment, the way people do when something they have been waiting for actually arrives. Then he opened them and he said, "My name is Robert Eames." He said, "I was one of 7. I will tell you that there is no accurate way to describe what it is to meet someone who was in your aircraft. Not in the abstract sense of knowing that your flights mattered, not in the aggregate count of 308, but specifically to look at a specific person who is standing in a restaurant in Georgia, alive, and know the exact night and the exact valley and the exact moment when that continued existence became an outcome that still required a decision. I had wondered about them sometimes, the ones I'd brought out. Not obsessively, occasionally. The way you wonder about things that marked you permanently, even as you continued forward. I had never expected to meet one. Robert Eames turned slightly so that the whole table could hear him. This was deliberate. I could see that it was deliberate, that he had thought about how to do this before he stood up. He said he needed to tell my family something. He said that on the night of September 12th, 2010, he and 6 other soldiers from his unit were in a position in the mountains of Kunar Province that had gone very badly wrong very quickly. 3 men from his unit were already dead. 7 were wounded. 2 of the 7 were critical, which means they had minutes rather than hours. Their radio operator had managed to reach extraction command, but the position was under active fire from multiple directions, and the terrain was a narrow valley with steep walls on both sides that made the approach extremely technical even. In good conditions and good light, it was not good conditions. It was dusk going to full dark, and the valley walls were close enough that rotor clearance was a calculation rather than a given. He said 2 aircraft attempted the approach. The first took fire on the approach and had to pull out. He said he remembered lying on the ground watching it go and thinking that was the end of the calculation. He said he remembered very clearly the specific thought that they were not going to get out. He said the second aircraft came in anyway. He said it took hits. He said he could hear the rounds striking the fuselage from where he was lying on the ground waiting for extraction. He said it did not leave. My father had stopped breathing in the way people stop breathing when something is reshaping their understanding of a thing they believed they already understood. Robert Eames looked at my father. He said, "Sir, I don't know how much you know about your daughter's record." He said what she did that night was not aerial medical transport. He said she flew into a position that was designated too dangerous for aircraft by the risk assessment that came out of that mission. He said she flew in failing light over terrain that required a skill level that he was not personally qualified to evaluate, but that he had thought about every day since. He said she took hits to the aircraft. He said she stayed. He said all 7 of them, who were alive when her helicopter landed that night, made it out of that valley. He reached up with his right hand and pushed the sleeve of his button-down shirt up past the elbow, past the shoulder. The scar was broad and layered, the kind that accumulates from multiple procedures done over a long time, scar tissue built over scar tissue, the architecture of a body that had been rebuilt more than once. He said, "This arm has been operated on 5 times since that night." He said the last surgery was in 2019. He said, "I still have it." He said, "I still have it because she did not allow herself to lose a patient who was alive when they reached her aircraft." He lowered the sleeve. He looked at Patricia. He said, "With respect, ma'am, she did not fly ambulances in the sky." My sister did not say anything. I watched her face. The color had gone from it in the way that happens when something arrives for which you have no prepared response, when the category you have been using for something is revealed to be entirely the wrong category and there is nothing to do but sit with the revision. She was very still. Her fork was on the table, both of her hands were in her lap. David's hand was on her arm. He had read the stillness and responded to it the way he always does, which is quietly and without making it about himself. My father said, "Robert." Robert Eames looked at him. My father said, "Thank you for coming over. Thank you for telling us." Robert nodded. He said he'd thought about it for a long time. He said he'd thought about what he would do if he ever had the chance to say something. He said when he heard the name, he knew he had to. He looked at me. He said, "I'm sorry it took this long to find you." I said, "You found me. That's enough." He said, "All 7 of us got through." He said, "I can't speak for all of them, but he'd been doing all right." He said, "I build things for a living." He said it with a particular emphasis, the emphasis of someone who understands the significance of what they're saying, the significance of building things after a night when you were not certain you would have mornings left to build them in. I said, "I'm glad." He shook my hand. His grip was firm in the way that comes from years of work and slightly irregular on the right side in the way that comes from rebuilt tissue, from 5 surgeries, from a body that had been put back together and kept going. He said it was good to meet my family. He walked back to his table, paid his bill, and a few minutes later he was gone out the door and driving north on the highway back to Tennessee. The restaurant continued around us. Other tables talked and ordered dessert, and someone dropped a fork and a child laughed at the back of the room. The corner table in Macon, Georgia, continued to be a restaurant where people had Saturday dinners. My father's retirement party continued to be a party. But the table I was sitting at was different from what it had been 15 minutes earlier. Dale Webb cleared his throat. He picked up his fork with the deliberateness of a man resuming an activity that has been interrupted by something significant. He did not say anything. He looked at me across the table with the look he has always had, the small nod that means, "There it is." I gave him one back. 20 years of that exchange, and it was still exactly right. My Uncle Carl set down his sweet tea. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Well?" He said it twice. He said, "Laura?" I said, "It was a long time ago, Carl." He said, "I don't imagine it feels that long ago." I said, "No, it doesn't." My father was looking at his plate. He was doing the thing he does when he is processing something structural, letting it settle through him the way a load settles through a well-designed bridge, finding the places where it changes the stress and the places where it holds. He is an engineer. He thinks in terms of load and bearing. I have watched him do it since I was small. He said, 61 times. I said, "Yes." He said, "You were shot at 61 times?" I said, "Those are the logged incidents." I said, "Sometimes it's informal enough not to make the log." He absorbed that. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "I should have known." I said, "That's a different conversation." He said, "Yes." He said, "We'll have that conversation." I said, "All right." He said it again. He said, 61 times, Laura. I said, "Yes." He said, "And the shoulder." I said, "And the shoulder." He looked at my right shoulder with the look of someone doing a structural assessment and not fully accepting the result. I said, "Dad?" He said, "I know." He said, "I know, I just, time." He stopped. He said, "You never said." I said, "I know." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because what would you have done with it?" He thought about that. He said, "I would have worried." I said, "Yes." He said, "And that's why you didn't say." I said, "That's part of it." He said, "What's the other part?" I said, "Because some things are mine to carry, and I knew I could carry them." He nodded. He did not argue with that. He is a man who understands the value of carrying what belongs to you. Patricia had not spoken since Robert Eames went back to his table. David was still beside her. Emma and Thomas had moved to our table at some point and were sitting quietly, Emma with her hands around her sweet tea glass, Thomas looking at the tablecloth. They had all heard it. I looked at my sister. I said, Pat. She looked up. Her eyes were very bright, and she was holding herself very still the way she holds herself when she is managing something enormous and doing it internally because she doesn't know how to do it any other way. I said, it's okay. She said, it's not okay. She said, I've been saying that for years. For years, Laura. I said, I know. She said, I didn't know. I said, I know that too. She said, why didn't you tell me? I said, because you didn't ask for the real answer. You asked in the way that has an answer already built into it, and I let you have the answer you'd built. She considered that. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that's fair. She said it in a register that is not her usual register, quietly, with the specific quality of someone who is genuinely receiving a true thing and not running it through the filter first. I said, Patricia, I'm not angry. I need you to hear that. I'm not carrying anything against you for this. You've described me with what you had. I never gave you what you needed to describe me accurately. That's on both of us. She said, it's more on me. I said, maybe. She said, it is. She said, I've been so certain I understood you. I said, you understand the version of me that exists in conversations between us? That version is real. It's just not the whole thing. She said, 308. I said, yes. She said, and every one of them got home. I said, everyone who was alive when they reached my aircraft. I've always been careful about that distinction. She said, you've been more careful than I have. I said, you've been careful about other things. That is as close as we have ever come to a full understanding of each other in a single exchange. It is not the full understanding. I don't think the full understanding is available, not between two people who have been in a pattern for decades. But it was real, and it was honest, and it was a start. The cake came out and the staff saying something, and my father looked mortified and pleased, and someone took a photograph that ended up being the one Patricia sent to the whole family the next morning. My father blowing out the candles, with his ears still red and his face open in the way it only is when something has exceeded what he planned for. It was a good photograph. It is a photograph of a man who spent 30 years building things that held the state of Georgia together, surrounded by people who love him, at a moment when everything had just become more honest than it had been an hour before. I drove back to the Hampton Inn at 10 that night. My shoulder ached from the drive up and from the sustained effort of holding a great deal of feeling in a small space for several hours. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about Robert Eames, standing up from his table across that restaurant. I thought about what it takes to make that walk. In a cockpit under fire, the adrenaline carries you. Your training takes over and your instincts take over, and the decision-making is fast because slow decision-making will kill you. Walking across a restaurant to find a person you owe something to and say it in front of strangers, that takes a different kind of courage entirely. That is the courage that isn't propelled by urgency. That has to carry itself on its own weight. He stood up and walked that room anyway, and I have thought about it every day since. I thought about September 12th, 2010. I think about it occasionally, the way I think about the 61. My co-pilot that rotation was a warrant officer from Montana named Sarah Kelleher, 26 years old, meticulous and calm in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that the right time to lose composure was never. When the first aircraft pulled out and the radio told us the position was still accessible and the patients were still alive and critical, Sarah said, on the intercom, the assessment says, don't. I said, I know. She said, your call. I said, I know. I went in. It is always the pilot's call. The risk assessment is the information. The call is the decision. There is always a space between them, and you live in that space for the duration of the approach, and then you are inside the valley, and the decision has been made, and all that's left is the flying, which you do, and the not leaving, which you also do, and then the bringing out, which all four of you do together, Sarah and me and the medic. A sergeant first class named Watkins, who had hands like a surgeon and nerves like plate steel, and the crew chief, a staff sergeant from North Carolina named Okafor, who would later be cited separately for his work that night. 7 people alive at the end. That is what the record says. What the record does not say is the 4-second silence in the cockpit after we cleared the valley. What the record does not say is that Sarah looked at me and said, "Good flying, Captain," in the flat, professional voice that carries more than the words, the voice of someone who means something much larger. What the record does not say is that my hands were shaking when we landed and I held them still in my lap until they stopped, because you do not let the soldiers you just extracted see your hands shake. You are the constant. That is the nature of the job. You are the constant, and the constant does not shake, at least not where anyone can see. I called Rosalind from the hotel room that night. She picked up on the second ring, which she always does, because she has the phone at arm's length on the nightstand, and always has. I told her what happened. I told her from the beginning, from Patricia's comment through Robert Eames standing up and everything he said. She was silent in a way that was nothing like her usual mode, which is to say she did not interrupt once, did not deploy a single piece of her very accurate absurdist humor, did not say anything until I was completely finished. Then she said, "I always knew it would." I said, "You always knew what would..." She said that the truth would arrive, not because anything I did was magic or inevitable, but because the work was real, and real things have a way of finding the people who did them. She said she had known from the first time Patricia had said it in front of her, years ago, that one day the distance between the description and the reality was going to close. She said, "I just didn't know it was going to close like that." I said, "It was something." She said, "Laura." I said, "What?" She said, 308 missions, and you never lost one who made it to your aircraft." She said it quietly, which is not her register. And the quietness of it was the thing that got to me in the way that the evening itself somehow had not fully gotten to me yet. I said, "That's right." She said, "You know what that is." I said, "Yes." She said, "Say it." I said, "It's 22 years of doing the work correctly." She said, "It's 22 years of being exactly what those 308 people needed at the exact moment they needed it." She said, "I'm so proud of you, it doesn't fit in normal words." I said, "I know." She said, "Good." She said, "Now get some sleep." She hung up and sent me a card 2 days later. It arrived while I was back in Savannah, and I read it standing next to the coffee maker. It said 5 words. It said, "I always knew it would." I put it on the counter, and it has been there since. Patricia called me the following morning. I was already on the highway heading south, the Georgia pines blurring past on both sides in the early light. She said she had been up most of the night. I said I could tell from her voice. She said she had been thinking about something I said at the table, about asking in a way that already has the answer. She said she did that. She said she did it with clients and with David and with our father and probably with everyone she was close to, that she built the answer first and then asked the question that confirmed it, and she had never quite seen it in herself the way I named it. I said, "You've always known your own mind, Pat." She said, "I've always assumed I know other people's." I said, "That's different." She said, "Yes." I said, "You're very good at people in the general direction." She said, "I've been very bad at you specifically." I said, "Not bad, just working with limited information." She said, "Information you would have given me if I'd asked for it." I said, "Probably, yes." She said, "I should have asked." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Can I ask now?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Tell me about the missions. Not all of them. Just tell me what it actually was. What you were doing over there." I said, "That's going to take more than this drive." She said she knew. She said she wanted to come to Savannah. She said she'd bring Emma and Thomas, and they'd have a proper visit, and I could tell her what I needed to tell her. I said I'd like that. She said, "I mean it, Laura. I know I owe you more than a phone call." I said, "You don't owe me anything." She said, "I owe you an accurate understanding of who you are." She said, "That's the basic obligation of a sister, and I've been falling short of it." I said, "You've been falling short of it with incomplete information." She said, "I didn't ask for complete information." I said, No. She said, I will. I said, I know you will. We drove in silence for a while. Or I drove and she was there on the phone and neither of us said anything. And the highway ran south under the truck and the sky was very blue above the pines. She said, I'm proud of you. She said it quietly and slightly crookedly, the way you say something you don't quite have the words for yet, but you need to say it anyway because waiting for the right words would mean saying nothing. I said, I know, Pa. She said, I've always been proud of you. I just didn't know what I was being proud of. I said, you knew enough. She said, I want to know the rest. I said, okay. She said, that is a mess, in a good way. He was up until 2 in the morning going through what I can only describe as a complete reevaluation of the last 22 years. I said, that sounds right. She said, he keeps saying 61 times. I said, yes. She said, I think I do too, honestly. I said, it was 61 out of 308. The majority were not under fire. She said, but 61 were. I said, yes. She said, Laura. I said, I know. I drove home. There is a box in my closet in Savannah. I have not opened it in several years. Inside it, there are 2 air metal with Valor devices. There is a set of flight logs from 2 deployments, 712 handwritten pages of route data and mission notation, and medical disposition codes for 308 extractions. There is a photograph of me and Sarah Kelleher and Watkins and Okafor standing in front of the aircraft at the end of our second deployment, all 4 of us squinting into the Afghan sun with the specific look of people who are very tired and very alive. There is a note from a colonel I served under, handwritten on his personal stationery, that says, Captain Morrison, I will not see your like again in this uniform. He meant it. I know he meant it because of how specifically he said it. Not with the general warmth of someone offering a compliment, but with the specific tone of someone making a permanent record. I don't open the box to look at any of it. The box is not for reviewing. The box is proof, for myself. On the nights when the shoulder aches and the house is quiet and I am carrying the particular weight of a life lived at a pitch that left its marks, that the work was real and it was recognized by the institution that does not recognize things easily or without evidence. It is proof that the decisions I made in those valleys were seen and counted and named correctly. Patricia did not know the box existed. My father did not know. They know now. I want to say something about what the ambulance description meant to me, because I think it is easy to hear this story and conclude that the wound was simple, that it was merely about not being given credit. That is not quite right. I was not carrying a need for credit. I have never needed credit. The missions were their own record, and the record was in those flight logs, and that was sufficient for me. What I was carrying was something else. It was the specific loneliness of being understood incorrectly by the people you love most, not dismissed by strangers, which is survivable and common, understood incorrectly by family, by the sister who grew up in the same house and who has spent decades believing she has an accurate picture of who you are. That is a different kind of weight. It has nothing to do with credit and everything to do with being known. Robert Eames gave me something I didn't know I needed until he handed it to me. Not the recognition, the accuracy. He put words on the actual work, in the presence of the people who had been using the wrong words for years, and the rightness of the words was what mattered. Not what they said about me, what they said about the work. She did not fly ambulances in the sky. She flew into active fire to bring people out who had no other way home. The distance between those 2 descriptions is the distance between life and death for 308 human beings. My name is Laura Morrison. I am 50 years old. I drove a 15-year-old truck from a Hampton Inn in Macon to my house in Savannah the morning after my father's retirement party, with my right shoulder aching from the cold and a card in the mail on its way to me from Houston. And I thought about a man building things for a living in Chattanooga, Tennessee, with an arm that had been rebuilt 5 times. And I thought about Sarah Kelleher saying, "Good flying, Captain," in the voice that meant more than the words. And I thought about my father sitting at a table with his hands flat on the tablecloth, processing 61 like a load his engineering hadn't accounted for. And I thought about Patricia going still in the particular way she goes still when the category has been wrong. And I thought about what it means to spend 22 years doing work that most people can't see clearly. Work that looks from the outside like one kind of thing and is from inside the cockpit at dusk over a narrow valley with rounds coming up from below and 7 people who need to stay alive. Everything. The whole weight of the decision and the skill and the not leaving and the bringing out. I thought about that for about 40 miles, and then I turned on the radio and drove the rest of the way home in the particular piece of someone who is no longer carrying something that was never theirs to carry alone. The real name is the name that belongs to the actual work, not the name people assign from the outside, not the efficient shorthand version, not the category built from fragments and confirmed by easy questions. The real name is the one earned in the moment the work was being done, and it belongs to the person who did it, whether or not anyone else can read it. 308 people went home. That name belongs to me. It always has. That is the only name that matters.